Intro. Picture this. It's a cold day in London, 1923. You're inside a sealed room, and the temperature suddenly starts to tank. It drops a shocking 20 degrees Fahrenheit, from a comfortable room temperature down to a chilly 43 degrees, or 6 degrees Celsius. The scientists watching this happen were floored. They had spent months designing a perfect, controlled environment, a room where nothing could get in and nothing could get out. They were pretty sure they were about to expose a young medium as a fake. But the weirdest stuff, like this impossible temperature drop, kept happening when the medium herself was just sitting perfectly still, in a deep, quiet trance. They had built a laboratory to prove ghosts weren't real. They never expected their own instruments to suggest they might be wrong. This is the story of the lab that scientifically tested ghosts and stumbled upon a mystery that still fascinates us today. Section 1. An Age of Spirits and Skeptics. So, why would a bunch of serious scientists even bother with seances? To get that, you have to understand what was going on in the early 1900s. Britain was a nation in mourning. The First World War had ripped a generation out of the world, leaving millions of families desperate for one last word, one final connection to those they'd lost. This ocean of grief created the perfect breeding ground for spiritualism, a movement that promised contacting the dead wasn't just possible, but something anyone could do. Seance parlors popped up all over London and Europe. Mediums, people who claimed they were the phone lines to the spirit world, became celebrities. They'd conjure up phantom whispers, levitating tables, and ghostly figures for audiences of both heartbroken believers and curious thrill-seekers. The movement got so big, you just couldn't ignore it. It was a direct challenge to the scientific establishment, which ran on materialism and evidence you could see and repeat. The claims of spiritualism were basically a slap in the face to this new, modern way of understanding the universe. Out of this clash, a new kind of investigator showed up, the psychical researcher. These weren't wild-eyed believers. They were often academics, doctors, and scientists who thought it was their job to investigate spiritualism's claims with actual scientific rigor. And one of them would become the most famous, and most controversial, of all, Harry Price. Price was a character. He was rich, endlessly curious, and a pretty slick amateur magician. His knowledge of illusions and sleight of hand gave him a huge advantage. He knew just how easy it was to fool people. He could spot a phony medium's tricks because he knew how to do them himself. In 1920, he joined the Society for Psychical Research, SPR, an organization created specifically to investigate paranormal stuff. But Price got frustrated with their methods pretty fast, finding them too passive and academic. He didn't just want to watch seances, he wanted to control them. He dreamed of a place where paranormal claims could face the ultimate test, a place where spirits would have to perform under the cold, hard gaze of scientific instruments. He pictured a laboratory built for ghosts. Section 2. Building the Ghost Machine. By 1926, Harry Price made his dream a reality. He dug into his own pockets to open the National Laboratory of Psychical Research in London. Its mission was clear: to investigate in a dispassionate manner and by purely scientific means every phase of psychic or alleged psychic phenomena. This wasn't going to be some dusty room in a haunted house. It was a state-of-the-art facility for its time, a machine built to tell the difference between fact and fraud. Price filled his lab with the latest technology, plus some clever gadgets of his own. Of course, there were cameras and sensitive audio recorders, but the heart of the lab was the seance room. It was built like a fortress. The door could be electrically locked. The floor and the chairs were rigged with electrical contacts. If a medium or a guest so much as shifted their feet to try and nudge a table, an alarm would go off and a light would flash on a control board in the next room. Price even invented a device he called the telekineticoscope. It was a simple telegraph key on a table, covered by a glass dome. The idea was that if a psychic force, or telekinesis, could move an object, it could press the key. If that key was pressed, it would complete a circuit and ring a bell. But since it was sealed under glass, no human hand could touch it. He had thermometers and barographs to track every little change in the room's atmosphere. Everything was designed for one purpose: to eliminate any chance of human trickery. The lab was a cage, built to trap a ghost. Section 3. The Rogues Gallery debunking the frauds. Before Price could find a real ghost, he had to wade through a sea of fakes. And believe me, there were a lot of them. Price's laboratory quickly became the terrifying final exam for some of Europe's most famous mediums. One by one they came, and one by one, most were exposed. One of his most famous takedowns was the medium Frederick Tansley Munnings, who claimed to channel historical figures like Julius Caesar. Price invited Munnings to the lab and used a voice control recorder. By comparing the sound waves of Munnings's normal voice to the spirit voices, he proved they were exactly the same. Munnings was just a talented voice actor. In 1928, he sold his confession to a Sunday newspaper. Then there was Helen Duncan, a Scottish medium famous for producing ectoplasm, a spooky substance said to be the physical form of spirit energy. In dark seance rooms, people were awestruck as cheesecloth-like tendrils streamed from Duncan's mouth and nose. But under the bright lights of Price's lab, the illusion crumbled. Photos showed the ectoplasm for what it really was: cheesecloth, rubber gloves, and magazine cutouts of faces that she would swallow and then regurgitate at the perfect moment. Following Price's report, Duncan's former maid confessed to helping with the tricks, and it's widely reported that even Duncan's husband admitted the ectoplasm was faked. Price exposed mediums who used their feet to move tables, chemists who used secret chemicals to create glowing spirit lights, and photographers who used darkroom tricks to fake ghost pictures. Case after case, the National Laboratory did exactly what it was built for. It acted as a filter, using science to prove that most paranormal events were just elaborate hoaxes. This winning streak was important. It made Price and his lab seem credible, tough, and deeply skeptical. They weren't looking to believe, they were looking for the truth. And that reputation is what made what happened next so completely baffling. Section 4, the Stella C anomalies. In 1923, before the National Laboratory even officially opened, Harry Price started working with a medium who was unlike anyone he'd ever met. Her name was Dorothy Stella Cranshaw, but in his notes, she was just Stella C. She was a young, quiet hospital dispenser, not a professional medium. She wasn't after fame or money, and her whole vibe was the opposite of the dramatic performers Price was used to exposing. She seemed almost bored by the whole thing and agreed to be tested under any strict conditions Price wanted. The experiments with Stella were some of the most controlled in the history of psychical research. She would sit inside a small, cage-like enclosure, with researchers often holding her hands and feet. The main event was a heavy oak table in the middle of the room. The lights were dimmed but never fully off, and a team of observers wrote down every single sound, movement, and change. Almost right away, weird things started to happen. In the very first sessions, the heavy table would tremble and shake like it was alive. Then, it would levitate inches off the ground and just hang there for a few seconds before crashing back down. Everyone in the room could see clear space between the floor and all four table legs. Then, the table started moving like it was intelligent, tilting once for no and twice for yes when they asked it questions. But the most mind-bending stuff was recorded by Price's instruments. In one session, the telekinetoscope, that telegraph key sealed under glass, suddenly went off. The bell rang, meaning the key had been pressed, but everyone could see that nothing and nobody was touching it. People reported feeling cold winds sweep through the sealed, draft-free room. On several occasions, the strong smell of lavender or roses would suddenly fill the air, then vanish just as quickly. And then there were the temperature drops. Across 13 sittings in 1923, Price's instruments recorded significant, rapid drops in temperature 3 different times. The most dramatic was a fall of over 20 degrees Fahrenheit, an event Price had no logical explanation for. This wasn't just someone feeling a cold spot. This was a physical change in the room's atmosphere, measured and documented. What made the Stella C case so powerful was Stella herself. Most of this stuff happened while she was in a deep trance, totally limp and barely breathing. She wasn't chanting or performing. For all intents and purposes, she was checked out. The researchers were in full control of the human element, but they couldn't control what was happening around her. Price, the master debunker, was stuck with a pile of results he couldn't explain away. The case of Stella C became the laboratory's greatest puzzle. For the first time, the machine had caught something that didn't seem to be a trick. Section 5, the unraveling of Rudy Schneider. Even after the strange events with Stella C, Harry Price's default setting was still hardcore skeptic. He knew how easily he could be fooled, and he never stopped looking for the trick. That commitment was about to be pushed to its limit by one of the most celebrated mediums in the world, an Austrian man named Rudy Schneider. By the late 1920s, Rudy Schneider was a spiritualist superstar. He'd been tested by researchers all over Europe, and many of them declared his powers were the real deal. When Price invited him to the National Laboratory in 1929, the entire psychic research community was watching. This was the ultimate showdown, the world's most famous medium versus its most famous skeptic. The experiments with Schneider were even more intense than the ones with Stella. Price rigged a system of electrical contacts to Schneider's hands, feet, and chair. If Schneider moved, breaking a contact, a light on a control panel would go out, telling the observers he'd broken the control. For years, Schneider performed under these conditions, and for years, he amazed the researchers. Objects moved, breezes were felt, and all while the lights on the control panel stayed on, showing that Schneider was perfectly still. But Price was never totally convinced. He suspected Schneider, who had been a performer his whole life, had found a way to beat the system. For a series of tests in 1932, Price added a secret weapon, a camera that would automatically snap a photo if a specific object moved. On the night of April 28, during a séance, a handkerchief on a table started to move. At that exact moment, a flashbulb lit up the dark room. When the photograph was developed, it seemed to show the truth. The image appeared to show Rudy Schneider had managed to free one of his arms from the controls. His hand was caught in the act, reaching out to move the handkerchief. Price published the photo, declaring Schneider a fraud. Case closed, right? Well, not exactly. The exposure itself became a huge controversy. Other researchers looked at the evidence and weren't so sure. They argued about the interpretation of the photo, and some even accused Price of faking the image to discredit a rival. The Great Showdown didn't have a clear winner after all. The battle with Rudy Schneider cemented Harry Price's legacy as a relentless, if controversial, investigator. It showed that even when facing seemingly impossible events, the search for a rational explanation has to continue. And if you love digging into the complex truth behind the world's greatest mysteries, go ahead and subscribe to this channel and click that notification bell. It's the best way to help us uncover more stories just like this one. Section 6, The Unexplained Remainder. You'd think a major showdown like the one with Rudy Schneider would be the end of the story. It seemed like the lab had done its job, proving that under strict enough conditions, all paranormal claims would eventually be exposed as fakes. But it wasn't the end. Because after dealing with Schneider, Duncan, Munnings, and dozens of others, Harry Price still had that file sitting on his desk, the Stella C file. He had a stack of instrument readings and observer reports that he just couldn't dismiss. He had proven that most mediums were frauds. But what about the one who might not have been? The Stella C phenomena were different. They were recorded by machines. They happened in a controlled space. And they were produced by a young woman who had zero interest in fame and who completely quit the seance world after she got married in 1928, never to return. She had nothing to gain from faking it. Price published his findings on Stella in 1925, presenting the raw data just as it was recorded, without trying to give a final answer. He remained a skeptic his whole life, but the Stella C case was a permanent question mark in his career. He had built a perfect system for catching fakes, and that same system had caught something else. Something that, by all accounts, shouldn't have been there. The National Laboratory of Psychical Research was eventually dissolved. Price moved on to other famous cases, like the supposed haunting of Borley Rectory. But the era of large-scale, lab-based paranormal investigations slowly died out. Science moved on, and the weird results from rooms like Price's were mostly forgotten, tucked away in the footnotes of history. Conclusion: the ghost in the machine. When you look back, the story of Harry Price's lab is just full of contradictions, isn't it? It was a place built on skepticism that produced unexplainable evidence. It was run by a magician who spent his life exposing illusions, only to run into something he couldn't debunk. The lab started with a clear mission: drag the seance room into the scientific world and prove that ghosts weren't real. And for the most part, it did. It showed that when you turn on the bright lights of scrutiny, most supernatural claims just melt away. But the lab's legacy isn't really defined by the frauds it exposed, but by the one stubborn puzzle it couldn't solve. The case of Stella C remains a fascinating and unsettling mystery. Her file is full of cold, hard facts, instrument readings of temperature, pressure, and movement that suggest something genuinely strange happened in that sealed London room. The scientists who walked into that lab thought they were building a machine to hunt ghosts. They assumed that by controlling every variable and eliminating every chance for human error, the supernatural would have nowhere left to hide. They never considered that the machines themselves might provide the most compelling evidence. In their quest to prove ghosts weren't real, they accidentally captured data that suggested otherwise. The lab was taken apart and its equipment scattered, but its central question still hangs in the air. It's not about whether they proved spirits exist, but whether they proved our own understanding of the world might be dangerously incomplete. The most enduring ghost they ever found was the one lurking inside their own data.